about a minute for everyone to load into the system, and then we will get our session started today. Good morning to those of you watching on Zoom. If you'll just give us a moment, we're going to let everyone load into the Zoom room and we'll get started momentarily. Good morning and welcome to WITA's 22nd Zoom webinar. We're delighted to continue to be the place for the trade community to meet and have important discussions about the past, present, and future of international trade. Since we started doing these webinars in March, we've had over 6,000 viewers on Zoom from over 75 countries and 37 states. Of course, you can't see everyone who's here with you on these sessions, but when you take part in these sessions, you're part of a larger global trade community. And we like to call out the names of some of our guests, so some of you know who you're here with today. So today we're gonna do something a little different. We're gonna welcome today to some of the USTR alumni who are watching on Zoom. So welcome today to Joe DeMond at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, Aro Argiro at Amazon, Christy Bliss at the Coalition of Services Industries, Lori Lizer at the Corporate Council for Africa, Dorothy Dwoskin at D2 Strategies, Darcy Vetter at Edelman, Chris Melly at AIG. There are more than 20 other current and former USTR officials watching on Zoom, so sorry if I missed you, but welcome to all of them and to all of you. As a quick reminder about some of our upcoming events, next Tuesday, July 21st at 2:30 p.m. US Eastern, we're pleased to host Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's been nominated by Nigeria to be the next Director General of the WTO. Next Thursday, July 23rd at 11 a.m. Eastern, we have an all-star panel doing a deep dive on the appellate body issue at the WTO. And on Wednesday, July 29th, we're pleased to welcome Congressman Darren LaHood to discuss U.S.-China relations and trade. We've also invited the other DG candidates and hope to be able to announce dates to be hosting them over the next few weeks. For today, we couldn't be more pleased than to welcome three giants of U.S. trade, Ambassadors Hills, Schwab, and Froman, to share their views on the WTO, how we got where we are today, and hopefully to give us a sense of where they think the WTO should go in the future. They'll be joined by my good friend and our partner in many of these webinars, Wendy Cutler of the Asia Society Policy Institute, who worked with all three of the ambassadors during their tenures at USTR. It's a real honor for WITA to host you, and we're grateful to you for joining us today. You should have, as the audience should have received their full biographies in an email before today's session, so we won't go into lengthy reviews of their illustrious biographies. But thanks again to them for joining us. After a discussion between the ambassadors, we'll try to leave some time for audience questions. Unfortunately, with nearly 600 people registered for today's event, we won't be able to get to every question, but if you use the Q&A function on Zoom, we'll get to as many as we can. Thanks again, Carla, Susan, and Mike for joining us today. Wendy?
Well, thanks, Ken. And it's really my honor to be here and to be asked to moderate this panel of three of my former bosses. I've worked for 9 USTRs during my career. I'm often asked who is my favorite USTR. So for today, I can tell you who my 3 favorite USTRs are. But honestly, I've learned a great deal from Carla, Susan, and Mike, and I've gained enormous respect for them. You know, many people on the outside, when they think of what a USTR does, they think mainly, oh, they're on planes all the time and they negotiate trade agreements. And yes, negotiations are a really important part of the portfolio, but they also are responsible for enforcing and implementing trade agreements, working with Congress and stakeholders, building support for trade across the country, managing an organization of over 200 folks, and doing this all every day, nonstop. It's probably one of the most challenging jobs in Washington, but I think one of the most rewarding and in many respects, one of the most fun jobs, maybe not every day, but overall. They've all served in this position with an enormous amount of professionalism, grace, perseverance, patience, and unboundless energy. And they've always kept the core US interest in heart in their jobs. Now today, we're gonna just focus on one part of their responsibilities, and that was their work with the GATT and the WTO. They have enormous experience with the GATT and the WTO, dating back to the Uruguay round, proceeding to the Doha development round. And then, as Mike and Ambassador Punk used to say, taking a fresh approach to the WTO and really moving more to plurilaterals. Carla was there when the dispute settlement system was set up under the WTO. Mike and Susan were not shy about bringing lots of cases against her trading partners in Geneva. But I think all three would agree there was just a growing sense of dissatisfaction with how the dispute settlement system was operating. We'll get to that today. Through the years, they've worked with numerous director generals, and that's where I want to kind of start our discussion today, because as we meet today, in Geneva, they're in day 2 of the so-called beauty contest among the 8 candidates interested in becoming Director General of the WTO. So with that, let me start with Carla and just ask you, in looking in selecting a WTO Director General, which qualities do you think are the most important, particularly at this time when the WTO is under so much strain?
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Ken. It's a great pleasure to join 2 former USTRs, great buddies of mine, and we have done a lot of work together, and it's been a pleasure for me. I'm hoping that the new Director General is a person who brings considerable experience, understands the WTO, has a management skill, and I would say also economics is hugely important. I remember way back when, you mentioned when I was there, and it's been 20 years, 25 years, Arthur Dunkel. The negotiations were in turmoil. We couldn't agree with Europe because of their restrictions on agriculture. Some things never get solved. But I would say that he came up with the Dunkel Memorandum in '91. And we met at the Blair House. I remember it so well. Ed Madigan was then Secretary of Agriculture, and I on our side. And Franz Andriessen, a wonderful man, and his agricultural guy was Ray McSherry. We pounded it out. It was tough. They walked out of the room. They came back in. We got a deal. It made a difference that we had the Dunkel Memorandum. And so I hope we have that kind of punch going forward because, as you mentioned, the WTO does need reform.
Well, thanks. Susan, let me turn to you, and I'd be interested if you would add anything to Carla's kind of 4 important attributes, and ask you, how important is it for a new DG to have extensive trade background, or is it perhaps more important now for the person to really have more access, to be more of a politician versus a trade expert?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, we've had models that have worked, both sort of the more former leader model, you know, the Mike Moore model, or the more technocratic model. You have to have some appreciation and background of trade policy, obviously, economics. I agree with Carla on that. Trade policy, economics, and some of the more arcane issues associated with trade. but you can have your deputy DGs and your staff and others helping you with some of the real details. The DG needs to have stature, but stature has to do with earning it as much as anything else, and getting, earning the respect of your colleagues. So, I mean, I think, for example, Roberto Azevedo, he has obviously has a great deal of experience, but he came in as a peer. He hadn't been a minister. He had been a WTO ambassador, but he earned a great deal of respect from his colleagues that didn't require that he be a minister coming in. On the other hand, you've had ministers coming in who had less general knowledge. But my first job was as a baby trade negotiator when Bob Strauss was the USTR. He knew nothing about trade when he came into the job. And I would argue he was one of the best trade reps we've ever had. So you can, if you are fast on your feet and you listen to other people, in a way, the DG, if the DG knows too much about trade and decides he or she has too many opinions, then you got a real problem, because that person, and Carla sort of implied this, you want this person to be a leader, but leader in the form of a facilitator, and not somebody who is going to be perceived as taking sides, right, and favoring one side over the other. So it's sometimes having great skills may ultimately be perceived as taking sides. That has not been the case, I would argue, in Roberto Azevedo's situation.
Okay, Mike, I'd be interested in your views there, and maybe just to add on to that, how important is it for the new DG to be kind of an activist and kind of push an agenda forward, not necessarily maybe not taking sides, but taking risks, versus really listening to the guidance and cues of the members? Can you do both at the same time? And what are the challenges?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to see so many friends here. And I agree very much with what Carla and Susan have said. I do feel like we're at a particular moment, though, in the evolution of the global trading system and the WTO in particular. It's a member-driven organization. It was intended to be that way by the Uruguay Round Agreement. And it's easy to get sucked into focus on the institutional elements of it. But to take a step back, the biggest problem we have right now is that there's a lack of global consensus around trade and around some of these major issues. And there's a lack of political will to get things done. And this is not just about a US comment specifically. I think it's a broader comment. And I would hope that the DG, the next DG, would be able to proactively, maybe this is where your risk-taking comes in, proactively work with the member states to help redevelop that global consensus and mobilize that political will. And so I put a lot of emphasis on the diplomatic capability, perhaps the political savviness that they might bring to the table. As former trade negotiators, we all think, of course, trade is such a specialized area that you need to be a rocket scientist in order to do it, but it's not rocket science. People can learn it. It is important. It is a very detailed area. You can't just fly at 40,000 feet, but you can learn it. And I would hope that whoever steps into this role and fills Roberto's large shoes could do so in a way that brought diplomatic skill and political skill to address that consensus and that political will gap that we currently have.
So maybe I can move on to, what advice would you give the next Director General? And specifically, there's so many issues under strain, from dispute settlement to negotiations to the treatment of developing countries to how to deal with the US-China issues. And the question I guess I would put forward, would you advise them to try and achieve some kind of smaller victories on low-hanging fruit types of issues, build momentum, or would you encourage them to try and use a honeymoon period to kind of score a big result that, as you know, at the early stages when they may have more political goodwill among the members? You want to start?
I can start. I think it's sort of a combination of the two. First of all, I'm not sure the extent to which DGs get honeymoon periods. So let's sort of begin with that.
Let's hope they do.
Let's hope they do. But I think I don't think we're going to have a single undertaking big deal negotiation anytime soon. So you're talking about building some momentum back into the enterprise because, you know, since the trade facilitation agreement, there's not a whole lot to show since, you know, show for the exercise since 93, 94. And that's one of the big challenges. So there are a variety of smaller negotiations going on. I mean, if smaller, but not insignificant. I mean, if you can get traction on e-commerce, that would be very significant. If you can get into some of the newer areas, that would be very significant. But at the end of the day, if you can't figure out a couple of fundamentals, and that includes what is development, you know, what constitutes a developed or developing member. Second, how do you address non-market circumstances? It's not just non-market economies. It's not just state-owned enterprises, but it is non-market conditions. How do you address those? Because the GATT and the WTO were not set up to deal with these broad challenges over whether it's overcapacity or these heavy-duty subsidies, hacking, those kinds of things. And we're not just talking about China here, but that's part of it. And then finally, the issue, obviously, of dispute settlement and the extent to which the dispute settlement mechanism is designed to negotiate and relitigate things that were left over and not negotiated by the members. So at some point, those, I would argue, those three need to be addressed by the members, with the new Director General facilitating some kind of dialogue and ultimately perhaps breaking some eggs in the process.
Carla, any input here? And would you advise the new Director General to pay early attention to the dispute settlement issue in particular?
Absolutely. But you asked originally about whether it be a big agreement or take the small agreement. And of course, a big agreement has trade-offs so that there are pluses in going in that direction. But I think that you do what you think you can get done. And I think probably because of the tensions that exist today, probably you're going to have to move in the direction as Sue described. My own view is that I hope the Director General spends time meeting with the parties that are involved and can kind of push them to think about trade-offs. You're never going to get 110% of what you want. You're going to have to, the other side of the table has to get something too. And so I'm hoping that that's why I mentioned management skills. The members do have the authority to come up with a solution. But you know, this business of having a ministerial meeting every 2 years, that just doesn't work when trade is in such a demand, changes in technology, the political problems that we face. We really need to talk together about these things. And so probably dealing with some specifics would be the way to go today. I might have given you a different answer 5 years ago.
So Mike, how important do you think management experience is. And one of the reasons I asked this, there's some new poll, and it wasn't scientific, but run out of Geneva, and the respondents were saying that management was like one of the most important issues, which was a bit surprising to me, but I would just throw that over to you. And then I would just also ask you another question. If you were sitting in the US seat today, when three director generals are briefing the members on their priorities and their experience and trying to make the case for themselves, what questions would you ask them?
So I too am a bit surprised by the emphasis on management in the poll, and that may be a Geneva specific perspective. And the Director General, of course, has to be effective both in Geneva, but also in capitals. And I think even more importantly, I think in capitals, in order to develop that support for what can get done through the WTO. So I would put a lot more emphasis on getting, as Roberto has often said, doing what's doable and making some progress on the building blocks to create positive momentum. I think the e-commerce agreement is one that is on the table, a lot of benefit to be had by a lot of parties, a lot of interest from both developed and developing countries. That's one that should bear a lot of emphasis. And I think the dispute settlement situation is one that has to get solved, and the issues around reform have to be taken seriously. And they're not, they didn't. The Trump administration has taken a particular approach to dispute settlement in the appellate body, but the concerns have been around for a while, and so I would hope that those issues could be addressed as well. I guess I would want to ask the candidates really what their plans were for addressing the changing perception of global trade and the changing politics around global trade in the major member states around the world, and how they felt they could help governments reach agreement as to what the WTO should do and be going forward, and really push them to do that. I'm a little less concerned about the institutional element of it, because I believe if there's consensus and there's will, the institution will follow. And the institutional strength will come from the fact that the member states have reached agreement on some of these issues. So I'd really focus on what their plans were for dealing with the major member states on the changing politics of trade.
Right, and trade politics are certainly changing. That's for sure. Susan, what would you?
If I could just speculate, if I could speculate about the polling question in Geneva about management, I have no idea, and there are a lot more people on this call.
Well, just to be clear, this poll was not among the member states. It was a kind of a private poll being done, but a group, I think, out of Geneva. Just to be clear.
Polling who though?
It was just people. It was not scientific. In other words, it was.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, forget it.
In fact, I responded to it online. So but I didn't put management first. I can tell you that.
Well, I think there is some, on the management side, to speculate, I think there's some dissatisfaction. This goes into the question of dispute settlement. I don't get the sense that there is a perception that the staff at the WTO is bloated in the way that there has been criticism, for example, of the OECD. No matter how good the OECD is, it is a huge, expensive operation. I think the WTO staff is pretty small. On the other hand, when you get into this discussion about dispute settlement, there is the very real question about to what extent is the staff running things when that is not the way the WTO was set up. The WTO is supposed to be the decision-making of the WTO is supposed to be made by the members. And you've got committees with very, very competent, experienced WTO ambassadors running them. And, the staff is supposed to be supportive, but not prescriptive. And there have been some problems associated with that. Anyway, you had a question, but that I'm just speculating there about the staff issue.
actually that puts it in perspective. Maybe we can turn for a minute to the US-China trade dispute and the issues that have come up with respect to China's economic model and the ability of the WTO to address these problems. Carla, you've been involved in US-China relations for many, many years. Do you think the WTO is up to updating its rules, for example, on industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and other related issues? Do you think we should give it a try to try and get the WTO to come up with those rules that would address a lot of the concerns with China now, as opposed to working bilaterally to do so?
Absolutely, we need to deal with the problem of subsidies. And China, by the way, is not the only government that provides subsidies. But, one of the great tragedies, in my view, for trade was when we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because that was an agreement of significant economies, and it had a very good dealing with state-owned enterprises and dispute settlement mechanism. And in fact, my own experience is that often plurilateral agreements like the TPP or like the NAFTA set a model for multilateral adoption. I'll never forget that the Uruguay round cratered in '90 in Brussels, and we negotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it took effect in '94. And within 4 months, the 123 members of the WTO returned to the negotiating table and took the protection of intellectual property, protection for services, the dispute settlement that they call the WTO, and members could do that today. I think the TPP would have been a wonderful trade agreement to pluck this, that, and the other out of it, that we would find ourselves in better stead today. But unfortunately, we are not there, but we may get back there. So we ought to be thinking about, how do we do it? And it gets back to your first question. Do we do it in step-by-step small groups, or do we do holistically? And probably because of the congestion that exists today, we're going to have to do it step by step.
Well, Mike, maybe I can turn to you, having been so involved in the TPP negotiations where some of these topics were negotiated, but also your involvement in the BIT negotiations. Do you think the WTO is up to, addressing these issues, particularly given, your experience not only negotiating these issues with China, but also with like-minded countries?
First of all, let me thank Carla for her kind comments on TPP. She was always a great supporter of that, and appreciate that. Look, I think actually COVID creates an important opportunity for us here. There's a silver lining, and that is that, as Carla alluded to, while China has been the major focus of conversation around subsidies, many countries, including in Europe and in the United States, are going to be addressing issues of subsidies as a way of managing this current economic crisis. And there is going to be a mutual interest, I believe, in coming to some set of arrangements and agreements around what's an appropriate subsidy for an industry, how long does it last, when is it to be withdrawn, what accommodations can be made given the fact that we are in the midst of a crisis and we all have an interest in saving our major industries that are under strain. And so perhaps this is a good time to bring parties to the table. I do think we're more likely to make progress, at least initially, on a plurilateral basis. Ourselves, the EU, Canada, Japan, other major economies, and hopefully come up with a set of rules. And this administration, the Trump administration, has begun some of those conversations on subsidies and state-owned enterprises to build on that in the COVID environment, perhaps broaden it. and come up with some rules on subsidies that then can inform a WTO discussion of this. But my guess is we'd be better placed, at least initially, in focusing plurilaterally with like-minded countries who now face like-minded challenges to address this.
Susan, maybe I can then turn to you just to talk a little about how you view plurilaterals. And in particular, do you think the time has come for the MFN principle to be adjusted? In other words, in plurilaterals, you make the commitments, you get the benefits, and not to have to automatically share those benefits with others.
So in this context, I agree with what Carla and Mike have just said. And so you've got, we have negotiated multiple flavors of plurilaterals, right? And different people, by the way, define plurilaterals differently. We've got sectorals, and we've got regionals, and we've got free trade agreements, bilaterals. So if you define plurilaterals as anything that isn't a multilateral, right, for purposes of this conversation, some of them are MFN, some of them are not MFN. Tokyo round, we had codes of conduct. We have the government procurement agreement that is non-MFN. You come into the agreement, you pay up, and the only members, WTO members, or at that point GATT members, that have access to the benefits are the ones that have paid up. So there is a precedent for non-MFN agreements. And I think we need to go back and examine that and see whether there are other opportunities within the WTO to do that. Obviously, we do that in the context of regional trade agreements and preferential trade agreements. The idea, though, in those kinds of non-MFN agreements is if a member or a prospective member is willing to pony up, is willing to meet that higher bar, right, that your coalition of the ambitious set, then they should be able to come in. And if they can't or don't meet that higher bar, then it's too bad, they can't come in. The real question becomes, and you can do these on smaller or larger deals, right? You can do these on information technology agreement. But I mean, if you look, for example, the environmental goods agreement as an example, which I think we launched, Charlene might have launched it, we launched it, Mike was still negotiating it, and you had a couple of countries, China, holding it up, and it still hasn't been done. Well, you've got the substantially all trade issue sitting there, and I think that issue becomes just as, if not more important, than the non-MFN issue. And it seems to me the question we need to be thinking about is, should we just say to the lowest common denominator advocates or the blocking advocates? I mean, you can almost do nothing in Geneva at this point because India and South Africa will block everything, right? You may want to get to the point where you just say, maybe we don't need substantially all trade. And there's a risk, by the way, that the US gets stung by that. But if you've got a coalition, maybe you do it in parallel with the WTO, but if you've got a coalition of higher ambition, go with it. And if China's going to be on the outside, so be it. I mean, one of the challenges with China, sort of looping back to your original China question, is those who negotiated with the Chinese, their accession, were negotiating with the reformers. They were negotiating with the reformers that fully intended to become a part of a more market-oriented system. Well, guess what? The reformers lost out. The reformers clearly did not win the day. And what is in place now doesn't seem to be able to accommodate the non-market conditions. And I would, truth in advertising here, the Asian Society Policy Institute put out, Wendy, was it this week? Really good study on this topic, that you are going to need to have a combination of policies, some through the WTO, some through, as Carla said, regional trade agreements. USMCA has some fixes on this. CPTPP has TPP addressed this. And maybe through the WTO, through the trade policy review process. Anyway, you're going to have to address this through a variety of mechanisms.
Well, thanks for the plug on the paper. I appreciate that. We put a lot of work into it, and I think it underscores there's no silver bullet here. And so you need to really think of a lot of different approaches that can be pursued simultaneously. I'd like to just move quickly to this issue of tariff rates and tariff bindings. There have been some recent suggestions that maybe the US should unbind its tariffs in the WTO, that the rates are not fair anymore, and we should use this as leverage to get other countries to lower their tariffs. And I would be interested in your views on this. And do you think this would just wreak havoc in Geneva, or do you think that there's something to this given the asymmetry in tariff rates, where the US and some other developed countries have very low rates, and other countries who have, were able to lock in rates at very high levels many, many years ago? I will offer this question to the first person who raises their hand. And if not, I'm going to call on one of you. Mike, thank you.
Well, first, let me just agree with what Susan was just saying. I like the coalition of the ambitious, and I think as long as it's open plurilateralism, we've got to create room in the system for doing that. There's a lot of emphasis.
And what is open plurilateralism for the audience?
Okay. So that if a coalition of countries come together and agree to a new set of rules on digital trade, or on reducing tariffs in environmental goods or healthcare goods, they can do so among themselves. In other words, potentially at odds with the MFN principle, potentially. But anybody who is willing and able to sign on to those obligations themselves can join that agreement and can benefit from it. It deals with the free rider problem. It's also responsive. There's increasing pressure for trade policy to look at reciprocity. And that's a little bit around the political shifts of sand around trade. Economists will argue whether reciprocity makes sense or not, but I think open plurilateralism is a way of addressing that sentiment while still creating the possibility that we get the benefits of broad-based liberalization. On the question you raise on tariffs, look, I think there are three risks associated with raising tariffs, period, whether it's bilaterally or reopening this at the WTO. One is the direct cost of the tariffs, and it's a tax on consumers and a tax on the intermediate people who use intermediate goods in their production. Two, it's the potential risk of retaliation. And as we raise tariffs, others raising tariffs in response. And then three, it's the risk of imitation. And if the U.S. has never had a perfect trade policy by any means when it comes to trade restrictive measures, but we've maintained a pretty high moral high ground in being able to say we live by these obligations, and we are a relatively open economy, and that's allowed us to hold other countries' feet to the fire. And if we're seen as, I think, raising tariffs, revisiting a number of our fundamental agreements, I think it opens the door, the Pandora's box, for other countries to imitate us and say, well, if the US isn't holding this to these agreements, why should we? And by the way, why not? Why limit it to trade? Why not look at our arms control agreements or other diplomatic agreements or territorial agreements, whatever? And so I think from a US leadership perspective, there's a risk there as well. All these risks can be managed, of course, but I would think twice before reopening all of our tariffs.
Okay, I noticed the time, and we're going to turn shortly to the audience for questions. I would like just to, the final question, to just get a non-WTO question, to get your views on the USMCA. All three of you spent enormous efforts in Congress trying to get trade agreements passed and counting the votes every day. And here we have the USMCA passing both the House and the Senate with huge bipartisan support and really unprecedented, members voting in favor of this agreement. And it also was an example where the administration worked very closely with the House Democrats to produce this deal then that led to, to enormous and solid support. So my question for you is, do you see the USMCA as possibly a model for future trade agreements, our new template? And if so, how do you think other countries will respond to this? Because one can argue that we had, our relations with Canada and Mexico, and the USMCA negotiation had its own unique dynamics. But I would just be very interested in your views, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ken. Carla, I saw your hand first, and I think you want to respond to a different point, but if you feel free to do that, then maybe you can tackle this one first, since you helped negotiate you led the negotiations on the initial NAFTA.
I was just on the last point going to point out that we do have some individual efforts that are trying to move forward to get out of the morass that we find ourselves. We have the group of three, the United States, Japan, and Europe, coming up with some rules. It may not take hold, but it looks like, I applaud the fact that they're trying. We have the Ottawa group that is trying to say, let's move ahead and have an interim appeal agreement. Let's not kill the dispute settlement mechanism. That may not be what you want, but it gets you thinking about how do we move forward. But on your question of is the USMCA a template for the future? Well, actually, the TPP was a template for the USMCA. They borrowed a number of things, the upgrade that we needed, and the subsidies agreement. There was and a number of issues that were well spelled out in TPP. Again, it's regretful that we pulled out of it, and that those things could be a model. I must confess that there are things in it that are more managed trade than open trade, so they don't garner my applause. I think that what I had hoped it would come out of TPP would be, we would be in it, we would lead by example, and China would join it, and that would be the way that they would deal with the reform that Sue mentioned, downgrading the subsidies and dealing with making even their state entities be governed by market principles. That didn't happen, but we have some non-market principles in the MCA, and that's unfortunate. So I applaud it. It's better than if we were to tear it up, but and not move forward. But there are some things in it that it would be better not to have in it.
So Susan, I think Carla, her view on USMCA, just to sum it up, in some ways it updates a lot of TPP provisions in some key chapters, but at the same time, there are other provisions which one can argue maybe are more trade restrictive. Do you see this as a potential template for future trade negotiations?
I think that every recent negotiation has pieces in it that are part of a new template, right? One could argue that USMCA was sort of a Nixon goes to China moment. Like only Donald Trump could get USMCA through the United States Congress with a heavy bipartisan. Only Bob Lighthizer could get USMCA done this way with this kind of balance. But it's worth pointing out that the 3 bilateral free trade agreements that we negotiated initially in the Bush administration that went through Congress during the Obama administration also had heavy bipartisan support. So there are pieces to a formula, and and it changes with the changes in public attitudes, with different members of Congress, different private sector, approaches. I will mention though, and this ties this together with your point about plurilaterals, perhaps. One of the things that they have in common though, is rather than using strict formulas, there's a sort of a request offer component to it. And going back to your reciprocity question, one of the challenges we had in the Doha round was a formula for non-agricultural market access that basically doomed the negotiation from the point that it was agreed in 2004. And that has to do with the definition of developing countries versus developed countries. What was going to happen with India, what was going to happen as China was emerging as part of this exercise. A lot of the developing countries were scared to death about imports from China, manufactured imports from China. So to the, request offer is a really complicated negotiation to engage in with 164 members, but it is a very big component of these plurilateral negotiations. And it may be that if you're going to start taking baby steps back to negotiating trade agreements, you may want to start with request offer, which may get you back into some of the more reciprocal relationships that some members are looking for, because they really are more product specific or sector specific than they are across the board. Just a thought.
Mike, any concluding thoughts on the USMCA?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think we ought to congratulate Ambassador Lighthizer for getting USMCA through Congress with the bipartisan support that it had, and for working so closely and well with House Democrats and the U.S. labor movement to achieve that objective. And I do hope that there are elements of USMCA, just as USMCA did take, as Carla said, a fair amount from TPP. I hope there will be elements of USMCA that do make their way into other agreements in the future. I think a lot will depend on how the politics of trade evolve. There are a number of things in USMCA that some members of Congress had vociferously opposed previously and were now willing to accept, as Susan said, perhaps as part of a Trump administration trade agreement. Whether that continues to be the case going forward, I think will help determine whether or not there can really be a bipartisan basis for moving these trade agreements forward or not. And I'm certainly hopeful that that bipartisanship will continue.
Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken, because I know we probably have a lot of questions in the queue from the audience. But for me personally, thank you very much. And it's just been my honor to ask you questions, having you guys have grilled me for years and years. So thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you to all of you. We do have a lot of questions that have already in the Q&A tab. I'll try to get to as many as I can, and we'll try to combine a few if we can. And first one's actually, I'm going to combine three people's questions: Ron Lorenzen, former USTR in Commerce, Mike Dolan with the Teamsters, and Brian Riley. So the question is, it has to do with the politics of trade, and it kind of goes in a bunch of different ways. Mike asks about, should we do sort of an assessment round to look at what's worked and what hasn't worked and what the impact has been on workers. Ron asks, how do we make trade more responsive and focused on the needs of the citizenry? But then Brian Riley points out that in the American public, trade is actually in some ways more popular than ever, but it doesn't always have the same nexus with politics. The politicians, notwithstanding, as Mike mentioned, the very big vote on USMCA, which had some remarkable new provisions in it on labor that I don't think any of us expected to see. But in general, the trade votes have been so much more difficult in recent years. So I don't know how we tie all this together. I don't even know who wants to tackle it first. I saw Sue kind of smiling at a couple of those. Maybe we can look to you first. Your thoughts about the politics of trade a little bit.
Well, I think all of those questions make a lot of sense. I think one of the things that we ought to start with is defining the underlying issues and then thinking about where is trade a causal factor and where is trade part of the solution. I think one of the challenges has been for all of us who've dealt with trade politics all these years is, leaders, politicians who look for trade solutions to non-trade problems, or who look for trade solutions to problems where trade is not the best solution, that there are better answers out there. And I think if we start with that and think about what can we do that will be more useful than a trade barrier, for example, or some trade distorting measure. If there is something, it may be that you got to go to a trade answer. I think that would help us create a more useful template going forward.
Mike, please.
Can I just add to that? I think the questioners are absolutely right that we need to make sure that we very much understand the impact of trade on workers and on society and incorporate those concerns into our trade policy. But to Susan's point, I think we have to situate trade policy in the broader policy framework. One thing I think administrations, Republican and Democratic, have not done enough of is the domestic response to globalization and technological development. And we're seeing again this, particularly in the COVID era, the impact on the financially vulnerable. How do we make sure we have policies in place to address that? And whether it's our retraining, and not just TAA, which is necessary but insufficient and inadequate, but a comprehensive domestic response that addresses how do you help workers succeed in a rapidly changing economy, whether those changes are coming from trade or coming from technology. What needs to be done in terms of lifelong learning, portable benefits, a redefined social safety net, because I think that will go a long way towards bridging that gap that we see in the polls between people saying they're pro-trade, they're internationalist, and the concerns they have about being displaced personally by virtue of these changes.
My own view is that I agree with Mike. I think trade creates growth, but domestic policy distributes the growth. And it's political how you distribute it. There are going to be overall benefits by opening up your market, and you've known that since the 15th century, that will create growth. But Mike has put it very well, that we have to deal with the political problem of distributing the growth that each nation has for the benefit of the people, or they're going to blame trade, and we're going to lose the benefits there.
Thank you for that. I want to pivot to a couple of questions that have come in about what a future WTO or the WTO may address kind of next. Phil Levy, who was with the Council of Economic Advisors, I think at the time, Susan, that you were USTR, asked about, there's been a lot of big discussions, and we've talked a lot on this session now about big topics. We've also talked about some of the smaller topics, but e-commerce is a ripe topic for negotiation. But what other ways could a new DG maybe show some quick results and build some political capital when they come into office?
So I also know Phil from the Chicago, when he was at the Chicago Council, speaking of really interesting polling data. We've mentioned a couple. I mean, we've talked about e-commerce, environmental goods. The environmental goods agreement is a great example of something that could be done that has so many pluses to it. If China doesn't want to go with it, so be it. That would be a really good one where you can create a precedent and you just say, they don't want to be part of it, so be it. They're just going to have to pay the tariffs. Sorry. And that's unfortunate, but, let's try that precedent. Any digital trade, some of the precedent, USMCA has really impressive digital trade precedents in it. Can any of those be integrated into agreements at the WTO? That would be clearly a win. There are I think there's obviously going to be room for, and Mike alluded to this, room for discussion about sort of post-COVID sectors, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, that kind of conversation. That may or may not go anywhere, but it's probably worth having a discussion. You've got a couple of and that may be worth having a discussion about subsidies and barriers to exports, barriers to imports. It may not go anywhere, but there are a number of smaller WTO members that are already having that conversation. And why not have that conversation? But again, these are member-led, and a savvy new DG can identify some key leaders from among the WTO ambassadors to get these things, get some traction and get some closure earlier, sooner rather than later.
If I may, I might just follow up on that, Sue. And, this is you guys got to this a bit, but I just want to drill in just a little more. We don't have a whole lot of time, but do you think, what are the qualities, and this comes from like several of the questions, the qualities a new DG should have? A lot of these things, you can work out at a minister level at some point, but at some point you have to also go to the head of state level. And how important is it for a new DG to be able to make that pivot from the ministerial level to the state level and be able to have those conversations, to be able to bring closure to either a small deal or one of these larger deals? And you've all been in that situation where you have to walk into your leader and make the case to them and bring them into the room and make them pick up the phone. Is that something that we need to see in a new DG?
So I'll just start and say, I think it's important, but I think it can be exaggerated, the importance. I mean, when Roberto Azevedo became DG, he had not, as I said, he hadn't been a minister, and it didn't take long before he had access to leaders. That said, I don't know about the experience of my colleagues. It was less important that the DG had access to President Bush than that I had access to President Bush. I think the DG's access to President Bush was kind of a waste of everybody's time. My access to President Bush was far more significant. So I think you're really, the delivery of deliverables, as it were, has more to do with the who the trade minister is and who the Geneva ambassador is. That duo, can those two work together and deliver and negotiate? And that's one of the problems. You got some folks in Geneva who really can't negotiate because they're not empowered by their capitals, and that really slows things down, and that's terribly problematic.
Ken, I would just add to that, and it goes to Susan's last point, because the representatives in Geneva really have a wide range of remit, and some are fully empowered and are tied into their capitals well, and some are really kind of out there on their own and don't have the authority to do that. I do think it's important that the DG be able to engage with heads of state as appropriate. It's one reason when we were institutionalizing the G20 at the beginning of the Obama administration, we included not just the IMF and the World Bank heads at the G20 summits, but also the WTO and OECD and ultimately ILO heads there as well, because we wanted the leaders were going to talk about trade. We wanted them to also feel ownership of the global trading system represented by those institutions as well. And I think that helps make that nexus work.
I'm going to ask the elephant in the room question to close us out. I think I know the answer from the three of you, but we timed this. It's not accidental when we're holding this. Congress, every 5 years, as most of you know, gets to review our WTO participation, and there's privileged types of resolutions and there's all kinds of rules, but there may be votes in the House or Senate in the coming days or weeks about a withdrawal from the WTO. What would be your views on whether that is a good idea or a bad idea? I think this is a bit of a leading question, I apologize, but give you guys a chance to just say why you think the passage of such a resolution might be a good or a bad idea.
I think it would be not only a bad idea, but a very, very bad idea. I think that what we want to do is to have rules for international commerce when we have globalization. It may be that there are a group of people who don't like that word, globalization. But the fact is that services and digital sales are taking over what I call the economy of the hand. And so just like virus, we can cross the borders silently. And so it's important that we have rules. We've also noted that when we have rules, rule of law, that it encourages less developed countries to develop rules domestically. And so that we're spreading rule of law, that concept, beyond our borders. So I think that trade negotiations that deal with rules to govern commerce are extremely important for the rich, the poor. And I'll stop there because I know you're running out of time, but I could go on.
You want me to follow up? I mean, I agree with what Carla said. I think it'd be dumb as dirt. I mean, why the only people who would be hurt by us leaving the WTO would be us, US exporters. You would be jeopardizing over $1.5 trillion in US exports, well over $1.5 trillion in US exports. You'd be hurting US farmers, US manufacturers, US service providers. And by the way, you would be handing yet another multilateral institution to the Chinese. So other than that, it's really a terrific idea. And it just strikes me as being kind of a silly undertaking, but I don't feel strongly about it one way or the other.
Yeah, I think we're in violent agreement. And it doesn't mean that the WTO doesn't need to be updated and reformed, but you do that by engaging and by showing leadership. And this is a great opportunity for Congress to demonstrate that we are committed to doing just that, engaging, showing leadership, reforming where necessary the international global system.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all. Yeah. And I'd add, Ambassador Lighthizer himself has said, and I don't know who owns this originally, but if we didn't have a WTO, we'd need to create one, I think is the line.
Yes, he did say that.
He has said it. I don't know who. I've always looked for I've searched the internet far and wide to see who said it first.
He is correct, and I think we've all said it at one point.
So thank you to all of you. Couldn't be more grateful than to have you join us today at this time. I hope you were all staying safe. Wendy, any final words?
Just a big thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. We ran over just by a couple of minutes. Really appreciate your time. Thank you. We hope to see you again at WITA. We will continue hosting these sessions, and we are continuing our discussions of the WTO. We have the DG candidates coming in, including next week with Dr. Ngozi on Tuesday. And on Thursday, we're going to do a deep dive with some real experts on WTO reform and the appellate body reform. So thank you all for joining us. Really grateful. Thanks to all of you who've been watching and stayed with us. We look forward to seeing you all again. Everybody take care of yourself and wear a mask.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Wendy. And thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Bye-bye.